So it's been about a year since Rory and Mal were a part of the cast of the Joe Budden Podcast, and I did go into detailed documentation on what happened, kept track of everything, all the details, who got fired, who did what, who said what, and I kind of kept y'all pretty up to date. Today it's been about a year since Rory and Mal and Joe Budden have broken up from the Joe Budden Podcast, and also it's been like a year since Ice and Ish, the new co-host on the Joe Budden Podcast, have been on the Joe Budden Podcast. Now, I have a few takeaways because I don't know if I have a popular opinion, but personally, I feel like the podcast is better than it was before. Probably not way better, but I think that the podcast is better than it was before. And these are my reasons why. Now, my first reason why I feel like that podcast with the new cast is better is because, well, I feel like Ish especially, but Ice and Ish both challenged Joe way more than Rory and Mal have challenged Joe in the past. And I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm listening to conversations, when I'm listening to discourse, I don't want to hear like a whole bunch of like empty reasonings to disagree with something. Like if you're disagreeing, have a reason to why you disagree. Obviously it's your right to just disagree, but realize you're on a podcast. So all that little like regular rules of life, like, oh, this is just my opinion, I disagree, and then not backing it up with anything valuable is dry. Pretty much every time I tune into the Joe Budden Podcast this time around, when Ish or Ice disagree with Joe, instead of just saying they disagree or being safe or not being confrontational, they'll let them know, I disagree and this is why. And that happens all the time. And the reason is not some dry moral high ground stuff. It's just being honest. And honestly, I feel like that comes from them probably knowing Joe more than, especially knowing Joe more than Rory specifically. Mal is like a real quiet dude, and I have tuned into Rory and Mal's podcast / experience, whatever you want to call it, and it's not half bad, but them boys is dry, bro. I'm not gonna lie, it's like they boring. It's not even a knock on them. That kind of was the case even when they were on the Joe Budden Podcast. They could get a little dull and a little boring. Another reason I like the Joe Budden Podcast a little bit more than I did in the past with the new cast is because, well, like I just mentioned, Ice and Ish knew Joe for like a very long time. They're like actual like real life friends. Yes, Mal was a real life friend, but Rory kind of was like an add-on, I'm not gonna lie. Almost stepped in the hole. And I feel like when he brings up references to like things in the past that the viewers may not know, Ice and Ish get it. Sometimes if it's suitable to be put on the podcast, they'll like bring it up, they'll kind of like explain it. And with Rory and Mal, like, once again, they kind of didn't really talk much. My third reason for liking the podcast more than I did in the past is because Ice and Ish are not necessarily PC. Now, when we get into political talking, Ish will kind of lock in a little bit and not say much, but we know why. He really got like real facts or whatever. He really got things he believes that may not be suitable for the podcast. You know what they do with that? They put that content on Patreon. Now, I know Rory and Mal was around for the Patreon deal, and if I'm not mistaken, they did have a couple Patreon episodes, but I don't even think I was willing to tune in to hear them talk like candidly off the podcast, because their energy just was so dry to me. I'm not gonna lie. I feel like with this current cast of the Joe Budden Podcast, the roles of the whole cast is more defined. When we're talking about hip hop, when we're talking about the new ratchet rappers, the hood rappers and all of that, we go to Ice. Ice is tapped into that. He listens to that music. He actually listens to albums and all of that. When we're talking about coming from like a more political standpoint, Ish is the guy to go to when we're talking about laws and stuff. And I'm not gonna say they like know every damn thing, but they just seemed a bit more well versed than Rory and Mal. Rory, musically, his understanding of music was cool, but I always felt like he was like snobby with his knowledge. Mal, if it ain't Jay-Z, it ain't flying. He was like one of them boys. I ain't gonna lie. He was telling niggas like St. John was nice. Not saying St. John not nice, but he was trying to push. I think ImBucky and St. John did a song together, and ImBucky had a verse on that St. John project. And you know, Mal is invested in St. John, but he said that was the best ImBucky verse I've ever heard. And I know I'm nobody to judge somebody's opinion, but come on, man. The best ImBucky verse I've ever heard was on a St. John song. Like, takes like that dried me out, and Mal was full of takes like that. But like when we get to the real world stuff, laws, just being mature, Ish dominates that field. And then Joe is almost like, sometimes Joe acts as a moderator, where in the past Joe was talking like 90% of the time. I can even like dampen it down to like 70% of the time Joe was talking, and Rory and Mal and Parks was talking for the other like portion. In this cast of the podcast, Joe kind of only accounts for like 55, maybe 60% of the talking, which is a lot better because now we get to hear a lot more Ish, we get to hear a lot more Ice, and we get to hear from Parks. Like, before I felt like I was just listening to a monologue where like Rory and Mal were just moderators. Now at this point I feel like Joe's kind of like the moderator, and he gets to play more of a moderator role. Like, he still talks and has his points, and he still leads the podcast, but he kind of has like a more moderator type role on his own podcast, as opposed to when Rory and Mal was on the podcast and he kind of was talking a lot. And I feel like the more words you say, the more likely you are to say something dumb, something that doesn't make sense. And I feel like Joe had to like kind of jazz up the podcast by saying things he didn't necessarily believe, just to attract attention to the pod, because he was carrying them guys, I'm not gonna lie. But these are my reasons why I feel like the current cast of the Joe Budden Podcast with Ice and Ish is better than the podcast with Rory and Mal. I personally don't like dislike Rory and Mal. Like, they cool. They definitely accounted for some great moments in the Joe Budden Podcast, but Ice and Ish, they learn how to pod, and they pod, and I ain't gonna lie. Now, as far as all the business and stuff goes, none of my business. I don't know nothing about that, bro. I'm not gonna cap. Just as a viewer, this podcast look better than the other one. It feel better than the other one, and it's consumed better than the other one. But with that being said, I'm Bucky, and I'm about to get out of here. If you like the video, make sure to subscribe and share this video with a friend. I'm out. Peace.